we had an exterminator come up and look at the property. And he said that he could take care of the rats, but he couldn't do it if Roland was there. Because, first of all, he was afraid he would interfere by taking the bait away or, you know, unplugging the holes and so forth. And secondly, he was very concerned that Roland might somehow eat some of the bait and get very sick or die. And he didn't want to take that liability because that could have meant loss of his license and all sorts of terrible things for him. And, you know, there was a risk for the town too, liability-wise. So in our motion to the court, we asked that he be removed from the property for 30 days.
Yeah, but you know about the Bible? You hadn't read that, you said?
Right.
Well, when Christ on the cross says A-B-B-A, you know, he says, Abba, Father, for you. They know what they do. And they say that it's just sort of a textbook relative to the preferability or preference for logical procedure. So in your life, you get up at a certain hour and you eat breakfast at a certain hour, and you eat lunch at a certain hour, and you eat dinner at a certain hour. And the Bible, I think, occurs only in one's experience as a prime and problematical thing. For example, at this point in my life, at 50, for example, one might get one's own piece of property and discover that in the A-B-B-A concept, one took certain very basic steps in one's life, but went on to Ba-Ba black sheep, which means one made a few mistakes. Usually on a moral plane, one's made moral mistakes, particularly the mishandling of homosexual life, which has a real and very dynamic part in every male and female's life. But since the culture handles it a little bit obscurely, the tendency to repression and poor adjustment is kind of primary. Most kids, for example, the prodigal son myth, you know about that? You know, the kid goes away from home and comes back years later, God only knows what he's up to, but of course it's probably the same as has always been so. And the parents sometimes in a highly ordered civilization manage to control them to make it a bit more subjective, easier to get along with. For example, if your kid flunks out of school, which may be part of the system, or doesn't do awfully well, I think people do not often, it makes them a little bit quietist, so it's easy to get along with. But anyway, ABC is a perfect procedure, and the Christian system covertly somehow espouses ABBA, bad conduct, which will eventually lead with this. Then you might lose your mind, since the assumption is that, you know that phrase, someone lost their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Just means that they don't obey perfectly enough the dictates of some other intelligence. It might be the select men who say, well, your house is a terrible mess and they want it cleaned up, and so somebody should come with the exterminator and take care of the rats. That's a problem, or any number of other things. But it has religious bearings insofar as I spoke before, God sometimes seems to manifest itself in, are you in theater arts?
Yeah.
There's a lot of that stage work, you know, when do you go to stuff in New York, for example, and the sets and lights?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that stuff, I think, is inspired by this kind of experience. You find, I think, most composers or artists of some substance had a lot of this kind of association with the Christian system, in which they were sort of subjected to another kind of introduction to the presence of God, which I think you'd think, in conclusion, that, as I said before, God is present, but functions conjunct with the society in a way which seems to have a kind of shortcoming. There's something a little bit short about God's presence. God is not the absolute idealist, it seems, but has accepted and seems to take part to some degree in compromise. And ordinary truth is that sometimes the Christian system apparently functions as a money market. In other words, if you marry a girl, they might give you $1 million cash, is the word. But it's not as though it's the most moral adjustment is one that people make, because in fact it has the monetary advantage.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the selectmen and all that, so you feel as though, I mean, do you feel as though like your lifestyle here was questioned by people who just didn't understand your perspective, or?
It's not really so. It's that St. John, in the St. John Passion somewhere, Christ says, I really don't quite know what I have done wrong, but it's not in that tone. Christ is much more, he says something like that. He says, I don't quite know what I have done wrong. Pontius Pilate says, I see no sin in him. And on the other hand, life proceeds, and the assumption is, though I don't think the crucifixion are quite, that unless he makes a more conventional adjustment, which was consistent with intermarriage on the part of the people who are handing out the money, what they were trying to do was break up perfect marriages, and in context with allowing or taking over in certain cultures and decimating inherent metaphysical structuring. The assumption was that the people lived beneath the land which they were supposed by God to be a part of, in which case there was a conquering element. And the conquering element apparently had a lot to do with the distribution of money in the marriage for money system, or the Christians really. And I heard recently that the war against Germany after, in World War II, when
the first time we went to court, the court, because the court was already aware of his state of mind, had appointed a guardian ad litem for him. And the guardian ad litem, it just explains to his client what's happening in court.
A lawyer is required to do what the person wants as long as it's legal. Sometimes what the person wants is legal, but it's not the best thing for them. Okay? It sounds crazy, but i.e. a kid wants to go with mom because mom lets the kid get away with more. Okay? The lawyer has to go along with what the kid wants as long as it's legal. Okay? I can stand up and say, no, no, no. That's not good for the kid or the person. I took an attorney to him, but he determined he did not want an attorney. So Mr. Williams did not get an attorney. He wanted to defend himself. And my function in the courtroom was to get him to comply with the wishes of the judge and to listen to the judge. And that it got to be itself a pretty hectic trip, but it wasn't bad. It was just he didn't fully understand the court procedures and the way the court does things. And even with the judge giving him leeway, it was a let me reach up and take a hold of his arm and say, sit down. Listen to the judge. You'll get your turn.
He would not cross-examine anybody, really. He did one person saying that, are you sure the rats that have come to your house are my rats, or could they be their own rats? Which I thought was maybe a pretty reasonable question.
I mean, it doesn't take a nuclear physicist to figure out that if you've never had a problem with rats and somebody up the road is breeding them, and then at some point what happened was the population got so big that he could not sustain feeding them all by what he could carry back from the village every day in dog food, and they just started scattering. And no, the ones that came to my garden were probably not the ones he was feeding. I don't think they were. That's too far away from their territory. But I'm sure that they are direct offsprings. It doesn't take that many generations, each moving 100 yards in the woods before you end up here. And so I know that they came from there, and so does everybody else.